Welcome back to Silicon Wafers. Before we jump in, do check out the trailer later in this episode of Kyiv of Mine. If you haven't seen it, it's an absolutely tremendous documentary, uplifting and full of extraordinary insights into Ukraine. Now let's jump into the story of Russia's looming budget crisis, how fuel shortages, collapsing revenues, and war spending are squeezing the Kremlin. Can Putin even pay his army next year? That question is starting to be asked. And what happens if he can't? What do these pressures mean for the broader alliance between China, Russia, and Iran? The anatomy of Russia's budget crisis. To understand the immediate danger, we need to map how Russia's fiscal model has cracked under war conditions. For years, Moscow has run a heavily militarized economy. Energy exports, sanction arbitrage, deep state control, subsidies, extraction of wealth from occupied territories. This model is starting to fray at the seams. Here are some headline numbers that illustrate the problem. In 2025, Russia's total planned military spending is about 15.5 trillion rubles, an increase of 3.4% over 2024. That is the equivalent of 7.2% of GDP. But revenues are collapsing. Oil and gas receipts are down sharply. The budget deficit is swelling. That's according to Reuters. The finance ministry now projects raising VAT from 20% to 22% to close the gaps, yielding perhaps 1.3 trillion rubles more. That's in the Moscow Times. Meanwhile, Russia is tapping into its reserves. In May 2025, Finance Minister Siluanov confirmed drawing 447 billion rubles from the National Wealth Fund, about 14% of the remaining liquid reserves. And add to that, accelerated sales of state assets under the PSB, that is a military-linked bank, to raise emergency revenue. The picture is of rising war costs, falling revenues, and depleting reserves. As one analyst put it, keeping the war going means consumers must pay more for less. That's in SIPA. That is, the burden is shifting to ordinary Russians. Higher prices, tax burdens, and, of course, higher inflation as well. Also, the Kremlin's own business elite is starting to sound the alarms. They cannot criticize the war directly, but they can squeal about some of the problems in the economy. Alexander Shokhin, a prominent Russian businessman, warns that weak growth may no longer sustain defense, security, and social expenditures. Something has to give. That's in Business Insider. He specifically notes that growth forecasts for 2025 are now 1 to 1.3%, far below the 4+% required to support current spending trajectories. The fuel energy crisis is an accelerator of the problems. If the budget pressures are structural, the fuel and refining crisis is acting as an accelerant, forcing the Kremlin to act faster and constraining its room for maneuver. Russia's refining infrastructure has come under repeated Ukrainian drone strikes. The result, nearly 40% of refining capacity is offline. That's according to the Washington Post. Gasoline production is down 10%, creating a 20% shortfall in supply. That's in the Washington Post. Also, gasoline prices are climbing, in some places rising more than 30%. That's reported in Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. The state has responded with export bans, rationing in some places, for instance, occupied territories like Crimea, and higher imports, mainly from Belarus. But of course, these are starting to be blocked and indeed targeted by Ukraine as well. That is in the Washington Post. As one commentator called it out, Russia is facing a fuel crisis, with gasoline prices rising over 30% due to Ukrainian drone strikes on refineries. And others argue that this crisis forces Putin's hand on budgeting, taxation, and military priorities. Another side is that energy revenues underpin much of Russia's state revenue. Loss of refining means more dependence on raw exports, which face sanctions and price caps. And of course, Russia is taking a huge hit on selling them in this sort of grey market as well. Can Russia pay the army next year? This is the critical question. Will Putin be able to pay his troops, and certainly will be able to expand the army to cover any new offensives, because that does not come cheap? It's not a rhetorical question. Soldier morale, which is low at the best of times, recruitment, bonus payments, logistics, all depend on massive cash flow. If the state fails to deliver, it risks breakdown of military order, demoralization, and even mass desertions. The collapse has not come yet, but the signals are alarming, at least they are for the Putin regime. The Kremlin's draft budgets for 26 to 28 continue to prioritize defense and security. Bloomberg's Alexander Kokcharov warns high military spending suggests that Russia is not preparing for peace, but rather is preparing for more fighting on the battlefield. That's in Newsweek. But the draft also exposes tensions, how to reconcile continued war spending with weak growth and limited revenue base. And the reliance on opaque spending is high. As one analyst notes, upwards of 84% of defense expenditures may be hidden or buried in other line items, not explicitly flagged as being military. Meanwhile, the International Stockholm Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, estimates that by the end of 2025, military spending will reach 7.2% of GDP. That is a Soviet-era level of militarization, according to the Insider. But the real figures may be much, much higher than this, given the off-books spending. Well, let's imagine some potential scenarios that come from this. One, delayed or partial payments, reductions in troop bonuses, delayed wages, supply cuts. That can degrade morale and, of course, inexorably lower the combat effectiveness. Number two, reprioritization, internal budget cannibalism. More funds diverted from infrastructure, health, social spending to keep the military afloat. That accelerates economic pain in the civilian space. Number three, forced borrowing and monetization, increased deficit spending, bond issuance, if they can do that, or printing money. And of course, that comes with an accompanying inflation spiral. Four, and lastly, the internal collapse of peripheral units. Far regions of Russia, stripped of their mobilized manpower on the fringes of the empire, may become weak points. And indeed, just this last week, we have seen some regions are already seeing low-level protests, and these are largely in areas where ethnic Russians are a minority. Will Putin gamble further by expropriating Western assets that are left in Russia and domestic businesses as well, accelerating state privatizations or inflation taxing civilians? Already the pace of asset seizures has picked up. Businesses are being stolen from owners and stripped of assets or handed to loyalists. That's in Reuters, and you'll know this, of course, from the conversations with Konstantin Samoilov as well, who gives a lot of interesting detail about this process. It's plausible that in 2026, the Kremlin will face a crisis point, not necessarily an outright collapse, but a real test of its legitimacy, especially in its handling of the economy. Before we move on to the next question, I'd like to make a personal recommendation that I know you will appreciate. You may have seen my interview last week with the producer of the film series Kyiv of Mine, Ronnie Apteker. Well, I've partnered with them to help raise awareness of what I believe is an important series of films made for a Western audience to help break through absurd stereotypes about Ukraine, some of which, of course, are amplified by Russian propaganda. You can watch these films for free now. Details in a second. Kyiv of Mine is a documentary series about Ukraine's extraordinary capital, which I had the privilege to visit for the first time in January this year. The film production began in 2018, and of course much has changed since then. It's now 2025, and the story is far from over. Kyiv of Mine is a fast-paced, beautifully filmed, humorous, fun, insightful, heartbreaking, moving, and hopeful work. The very antithesis, in fact, of a doom-laden and worthy wartime documentary. This is a work that is extraordinarily uplifting. My friend, operator Starsky, says the film is made with so much love. The film series will make you laugh and cry. It's the only film about Ukraine that began before the war yet has traced lives through the tumultuous times, and which follows the lives of more than a dozen Ukrainians in real time. This is an historic period told through highly personal and emotive stories from Kyiv's days of emerging prosperity after the Maidan Revolution through COVID and the full-scale invasion. This film is a breath of fresh air. Ukraine deserves a better conversation in the world, one that isn't centered around war, says Julian Ellis, filmmaker on Kyiv of Mine. It's hard not to argue with that, and the filmmakers have fully delivered on this promise. This is essential watching for anyone who calls themselves pro-Ukrainian, but I think it's also vital to get friends, colleagues, and family to watch it too, because the reality is few people have a vivid impression of Ukraine or any direct connection with its people. War is inhumane and abstract. Building an alternative perception is essential for engaging the world with the importance of Ukraine's struggle. And of course, there are broader implications for this and some big picture geopolitical questions as well. Moscow's ambitions in Ukraine remain maximalist to redraw the map, absorb territory, force demilitarization, and even regime change, according to CSIS. But ambition collides with capacity. The budget pressures impose constraints on how far and how fast that project can continue. And of course, Ukrainian resistance and innovation create a hard barrier against further Russian encroachment on its sovereign territory. Russia's economic stress may push it deeper into repression. We're seeing that happen as well. The regime may double down on coercion, tighter censorship, emergency laws, conscription enforcement, fiscal extraction, all of these tools to squeeze the population further, and the authoritarian spiral intensifies. But if Russia succeeds in sustaining a war under economic siege, it may embolden other authoritarian states around the world to adopt similar strategies. Resilience under sanctions, how to avoid sanctions, how to poke loopholes in it while they proceed to carve out chunks of their neighbours' territory. In the great power game, a weakened Moscow has consequences for Beijing, for the Belt and Road Initiative, for Eurasian influence. China may have to recalibrate its support, financial, diplomatic, military, to Russia. China may have to recalibrate its support, financial, diplomatic, military, to Russia. Other ecosystems, Iran, North Korea, Central Asia, may become the focus for challenging the West and the struggle for global hegemony. Conversely, the West and Kiev can exploit the financial stress, the pressure points, sanctions, military aid, timing, psychological operations. Russia's internal fragilities may become strategic leverage for Ukrainian successes. If Russia's capacity to pay and supply is hampered, the front line could tip further in Ukraine's favour, and Ukraine, backed by Western aid, may push to exploit these supply chain gaps, targeting lines of communication, refineries, logistics nodes. And again, we're getting a hint of that with the first strike on a thermal fuel plant, a thermal energy plant in Belgorod. The fuel crisis already signals how disruptions can have strategic effect. For Ukraine and its backers, this is a window, a moment to press harder, to target and to provoke systemic stress in Russia. A final word from our partners, the makers of Kyiv of Mine. All three films are now available to watch for free on YouTube. Please check out the links to the dedicated website, which tells you more about the film, its subjects, and the filmmakers. Also in the description is a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch the films now. Do let us know in the comments what you think of them and if they inspire you as much as they have inspired me.